2020 has been challenging,
scary,
frustrating,
hopeful,
historic.
School shut down and then went virtual.
We're living in a global pandemic that turned our lives upside down.
And the country is reckoning with racism, fairness, safety, and justice.
Now, the 2020 election is here, and political messages are everywhere.
In fact, sometimes it feels like everything is political. It's a lot.
Let's be real. Some of the information we get is important and useful.
And some of it is misleading, and some of it is false.
How can we know who and what to trust? Are we prepared for this election and what comes afterwards?
Generation Z.
That's us.
Makes up 10% of all American voters.
So let's face the facts.
Let's find out how our actions as citizens matter.
Let's make sure what we read and share is the truth.
It's our future on the line. This is our time.
It's our time.
It's our time.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to a very special election town hall. I'm your host, Amna Nawaz, senior correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. Now, we are just weeks away from Election Day on November 3rd. Voting has already begun in a number of states, and there's been a whirlwind of news, including President Trump's COVID-19 diagnosis. For many of you out there, you're casting your very first vote this year. It's a huge deal and a huge responsibility, and we want you to feel good about that vote. So, for the next hour, we're going to talk about facts. We're going to talk about how to sort through all the information you're seeing on social media, how to separate the good information from the bad. And I'm really excited to hear from some of you first-time voters, to hear what you're thinking about and what you're worried about, and also to get advice from real-life fact checkers on how to spot misinformation about the election and how to trust what you're reading. We're also going to get some tips on how to balance your information diet so you don't let yourself get manipulated by bad actors or algorithms online. And I cannot wait for you to meet some really amazing journalists. You're going to have a chance to ask them about how they're getting ready to cover this election, one that, remember, might not be over on election night. We're going to talk more about why that is in a few. Meanwhile, the news is moving fast. So remember, some of these conversations you're about to hear were recorded before we learned about the president's COVID-19 diagnosis. But we're here with you tonight live. So head to the chat anytime to share your thoughts. Speak up, let us know what you're thinking, and send us your questions. Later tonight, I'll be live with a group of journalists to answer those questions. And remember, we need to hear what you have to say. Now, more than ever, we are in this together. This town hall is a partnership between the PBS NewsHour Student Reporting Labs program and MediaWise. These are the groups leading the way in student journalism and media literacy. We also want to thank Facebook for providing funding for this event. All right, let's start the show. We hear a lot about first-time voters, so now let's meet a few. There is so much talk about how politically divided and how angry the country is right now. But is it the whole country? Is that really what young people feel right now? To unpack that a little bit, Savannah Sellers, a correspondent for NBC News and a MediaWise ambassador, brought together 3 students who are about to cast their first ballots and one 17-year-old who's getting involved in other ways. Let's find out what they're seeing and living in these last weeks of this historic election.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Savannah Sellers, host of NBC News' Stay Tuned on Snapchat. This year alone, 47 million 18 to 29-year-olds are eligible to vote in this election. I'm excited to be here with 4 students living in very different parts of the country. We're going to hear how they've been engaging in this year's election, who they're paying attention to, and how they talk to their friends and family about politics. So let's get started. Guys, thank you so much for being here on this panel. I'm so excited to talk to you. Let's do some quick introductions, starting with you, Malik. Let's share where you're located, what school you go to, what grade you're in, and what you're looking forward to most when virtual learning and social distancing is over. Let's have a little fun with this. Go ahead.
I'm so excited to be here. I'm Malik Mercier. I'm a junior at Ithaca College, and currently I'm in Brooklyn doing remote learning. And when this is all over, I feel like I'm just very excited to go to a restaurant.
I'm Rebecca McKinney. I'm 18 years old. I
go to Dominion High School and I live in Northern Virginia. And what I am most excited to do is to go on an airplane. Who knew I would miss airplane food?
So I'm in Columbia, Tennessee, which is about an hour south of Nashville. I go to Spring Hill High School and I'm a senior. Out of everything that I'm looking forward to in the post-COVID world, I've got to say SEC football is at the top of the list. I am ready to get back in a football stadium. Y'all don't even know how much we live for football down here.
So my name is Cassie Ramel. I'm 17 and I'm located in Los Angeles, California. And I'm a senior at Daniel Pearl Magnet High School. And once everything opens up again, I'm so ready to leave the country. I want to go travel so badly.
All right, so with the exception of Cassia, and that's only because she's 17 years old, I know for the three of you, Jackson, Malik, Rebecca, this will be your first time voting in a presidential election. So as we get started, I just want to ask you guys a little bit about where you lean politically, or you can say that you don't want to share, also totally fine. Raise your hand if you are liberal leaning. And what about conservative? And who doesn't want to share? Okay, great. So everybody got to raise their hand. So I'm happy that we have this mix of viewpoints on this panel. I think it's really important that we continue to have these conversations with each other across the aisle. And let's talk about how you are talking about politics and about the election with your peers, if at all.
For me personally, since I cannot vote in this election, it's so important to me to reach out to people who are first-time voters, people at my school, also my teachers and any adults I'm nearby. So all the time I'm starting conversations about getting registered and looking up your local and state elections, not just presidential, as well as holding like voter registration drives or making events to convince people to get more politically involved.
Now I have the stigma of being the politician of the school. I know everybody knows that I'm the political kid. So I actually have had people seeking me out to have conversations, and I think that's super cool. There's a lot of energy around this election, and I know I've done my part to, tell people when they come to me, they're wanting to talk about the presidential race. But like Cassia said, telling them about their local and their state races, because those are so important too.
Jackson, I love that you're known as the politician. That's pretty cool. Malik or Rebecca, what about you guys talking with your peers?
Yeah, I just want to sort of go off of that. I think I've been hosting a show called Internet Expert over at GBH News, the PBS Boston affiliate. And so it's been really fun to sort of help young people understand the democratic process through sort of fun challenges that are all digital and online. And I find that sort of making it fun and making fun sometimes of political websites that are kind of boring and just sort of having fun with it and being really light with it, I think sort of gets people involved more in just understanding the process, and hopefully that turns out to be helpful in youth voter turnout.
Yeah, and I would just add to that by saying social media has become a huge outlet in terms of talking about state, local, and the federal election coming up, and some of the current events that we're seeing. So talking to my friends over text and FaceTime and over Snapchat and Instagram and TikTok even too. So I think that social media has really contributed into the way that I would say most everybody talks about politics these days.
Tell me a little bit about where you guys are getting your information, how you know it's credible, and where your friends are getting it, and if you're ever having to kind of dispute something that they're telling you they heard.
I think that a lot of the media that we consume, is kind of tailored by us with social media to what we want to hear. And I think that that's created a little bit of a problem in the modern era. And I think that it's really important that we get our news from both sides of the aisle.
I feel like the TikTok specifically has, really had this political discourse, as you said. And I think that what I've seen is that before in 2018, I feel like there was this, especially with the surgence of the March for Our Lives, this real strong idea that we were not going to, as young voters, go by a party, but instead we were going to go by policy.
What do you guys think that the presidential candidates should be doing to address this division that we're seeing in our country right now that feels really bad?
In these upcoming 4 years, it doesn't matter who wins. Whatever president is able to say, it's not about my ego, it's not about me, it's about making our country better for everybody and being able to have the conversations across the aisle.
I completely agree with Rebecca, and I think the presidential candidates should foster a community between the American people. We should all be feeling accepted and acknowledged for having our different viewpoints, and also come to a middle ground about improving our society, improving our community, and building a better country.
I was texting a friend about the first presidential debate, and he said to me that the debate wasn't about America. And I feel like that is such a resounding message, that it just wasn't about people and the policy and how it impacts people's lives on the ground, which I feel like really, really matters, especially in this moment where there are so many people unemployed, so many people that are suffering. And so I think when we can get to a place where we're actually having a conversation about the humanity of all of these different issues and how it's impacting people, that'll be a really good thing.
And I'd love to hear what you guys think about where your generation lies within this division. Like, do you guys have friends that have different political viewpoints than you that you're discussing this election, that you're discussing politics with? And if so, how do you do so in a way that doesn't turn into a screaming match like you guys described?
One of my closest friends, she is completely on the other side of the aisle, and we have great discussions, and they're informative, and we respect each other's side, and that's great. But I've also had friends well, they're no longer my friends now, but they've told me that I should be ashamed of myself because my mom was born in another country and that I am voting for Trump and that I am Hispanic. I should be embarrassed to be Hispanic and voting for Trump.
A lot of times I run into situations where I've had these beliefs and then I personally have gotten attacked for it. And like for my club that I have for Black Student Union, I've gotten like anti-Black like comments back on it, and then like, yeah, we're gonna start a all-white club that Black people can't be in, and I'm like, I'm trying to foster a community on campus. However, like I have to draw a line between like I respect your views and to the point where you're disrespecting me and almost harmful to the people I've welcomed here.
And I've had people who, are no longer my friend because of how I lean politically. I think that, it made me reconsider, what is a friend? Because, if a friend is willing to, turn on you and stab you in the back because you're voting for the other candidate, were they really a friend to begin with?
What are the issues that really matter to you guys, and how are you following them? How are you talking about them with your friends?
The single biggest issue for me right now is our federal court system. I'm very conservative, so I really like some of the judges and the justices that President Trump has put in our federal courts. That's a generational change.
I've been really concerned personally about mental health. I have OCD and anxiety, and I feel like that's just such a huge issue that gets overlooked at a lot of these debates. And I feel like it's something that our generation really cares about, possibly because our mental health just hasn't been that great with everything going on, a pandemic, just so many different things that happen. I think school's just been more stressful, and there's so many different people that are struggling all across the country. And I feel like that's something that really should be top of mind. And then I've also, of course, has been mentioned, looking at just sort of justice-oriented issues like race issues like we've seen, and just the amount of protest and everything that's been happening. It's not that it's just like one isolated incident and then people, I think, could move on. It's like we need to have a revolution because there is like no like freedom or fairness in the system that we currently have.
It's so hard to name one top thing that I'm concerned about for the election. I mean, there's climate justice and the Green New Deal opening up green jobs and cutting down fracking and fossil fuels. There's also racial issues, and systematically, there's so many areas in this country which I would hope for improvement.
Who influenced you in your political party? Did you kind of figure it out for yourself? Was it your parents? Was it a sibling? And what do you think is true for your friends?
Yeah, sure. I would have to say my mom, because I think from when I was in middle school or 11 years old, my mom had me going with her to lobby on Capitol Hill and take me to different galas and events, and just getting involved from such a young age that really helped me form my love for the American political system and for our democracy that we have. That's so awesome.
And for me personally, I think I have to owe it all to my sister and one of my friends as well, because they got me into the political spectrum and they really educated me and brought me to rallies and talked to senators. So I could understand what I'm going into. And as a youth, I think it's so important to be educated now, even if you are 14, 15 years old, because our politicians are shaping the world that we are going to live in and the world that we are going to pass laws and vote on. And it's so important to get involved, even at this point.
The people who have influenced my political leanings the most are some folks that have been dead for a couple hundred years. All of our founding fathers, John Locke, I'm a big fan of John Locke's writings. Montesquieu, all of the classical thinkers.
I feel like, especially for me, there are so many news stories that make me very sad and emotional, or they can make me happy, but I feel like the ones that like really are monumental in our country, like the Sandy Hook school shooting, for example. I think we were talking about satire that day, and our teacher was supposed to teach that, and she was just like, there is no way I can teach this lesson today. And she just started crying in front of our middle school class, and she said, make sure you make this world better than when you came into it. And I've just always kept that with me. And I think that motivates me to continue to get into politics and to talk about it and to talk about the issues, because it really impacts people's lives and whether we live or die in some cases. And so I think that that's just really important.
Okay, my last question is $1 million question, because we're all wondering. So I want to know, from what you guys are hearing, from what you're seeing in your schools, how your friends are feeling, do you think Gen Z is going to show up at the polls?
100 billion% they're going to show up at the polls. I mean, like I was saying earlier, I can log on to every single social media site. Even on Quizlet, you can register to vote right from Quizlet.
Like Rebecca said, everywhere you can sort of register to vote. It's everywhere. And I think that, again, with all of the issues, like I think people are going to have reasons that they're voting more than ever. And I think that is so cool. And go vote.
I love you guys. You have so much wisdom for your years. And I just think it's so, again, inspiring and hopeful. I mean, we just had this conversation with all of you who identified differently on the political spectrum, and we were just able to have this fantastic conversation together, which again is something that is not necessarily happening with a lot of people who are a lot older than you guys. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for sharing what you're feeling about this election. For those of you who are voting for the first time, enjoy it. And Cassia, you'll be right behind them.
Soon.
Thank you guys so much for your time. I so appreciate it.
We have an election coming up, so are you planning on voting?
Absolutely.
Can you tell me a little bit about your first time voting?
Yes, the first time I voted was in 1998, and the primary race was the Minnesota gubernatorial race. That was the year that Minnesota elected Jesse Ventura, Jesse the Body, former wrestler and actor in those Arnold Schwarzenegger Predator movies. He ran for governor as this alternative candidate. He ran a really kind of flashy, comical campaign. And I think one of the undertones with his campaign was, I mean, how much harm could it really do? Let's take a risk. Let's see what happens. Let's upset the system and try something new. And so I voted for him, and I was excited to vote for him.
Do you remember kind of what were some of the things going on during that time?
I was watching the results roll in on TV when I realized that Jesse Ventura's election eve party was at the horse racing track, which was not terribly far from where I grew up, where my mom still lives. And so I thought, well, I'm gonna go down there and see this firsthand. I got to this, packed hall, smoky hall, lots of beer flowing, lots of noise. It was just a party. Lo and behold, television flashed that Ventura had won. A couple months later, I enrolled in a state school in Minnesota and watched as Jesse Ventura, who really had no business in government, I don't think had much interest in government either, took a state surplus, which he inherited, and just kind of watched that surplus dwindle until he left the state with a significant deficit. My introduction into voting started out very exciting, and I quickly came to realize the real world, rubber meet the road implications of that vote.
Let's take a closer look at what it means to be a first-time voter. Nuria Hayat is here to help us understand the bigger picture about young Americans and how they vote. Nuria works at Tufts University with a research group called CIRCLE. That's the Center for Information Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. Nuria, welcome to you, and thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So when we talk about elections and we talk about young Americans, it's kind of more of a question of if they vote rather than how they vote. When you look at participation rates, take us back to 2016 for an example. What do we know about the participation rates for 18 to 24-year-olds in America, and how does that compare to older Americans?
In 2016, that turnout number in Gen Z was 42%. So 42% of eligible young voters actually cast a ballot. We know from research that Gen X, Boomer generation, and even the millennials, they voted at similar rates when they were the same age as Gen Z and first-time voters. Yes, turnout for young people tends to be lower than older generation, but that gap is closing at some point. For instance, in 2018, we had an unprecedented, remarkable increase in young people voting in a midterm election, which hasn't really happened in the past almost 5 decades.
Fascinating look at Gen Z and young Americans and how they vote here. We're going to see, of course, what happens in the next election. And up next, we're going to hear more about what it takes to register Gen Z voters from someone who does it for a living. That's Kellen Edmondson. He works with Head Count. It's a nonpartisan group that organizes voter registration events and campaigns. Kellen, welcome and thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
I want to share with you a couple of specific questions we have coming from students out there. Here now is a question from Devin Newby. Devin is a graduate student in Minnesota. Take a listen to this.
I'm an SRL alum living in Minneapolis, just blocks away from where George Floyd was killed. During protests here, our community's post office was burnt down. It served many of the city's low-income residents who do not have consistent internet access and who rely on public transportation to get around. My question is, how can residents, and especially the young residents who have never done this before, be sure that they are registered to vote?
So, Kellen, what would you say to Devin about his concerns?
I would say that that is definitely a very difficult situation. I think there's a big role for local organizations that especially work with youth on the ground to provide that credible information. And so what we want to do is ensure that these folks, again, have all the possibilities in front of them, lay those out, and make a plan to vote.
Speaking of questions, I've got one more for you now. This comes from Morgan Fisher. Morgan is a Student Reporting Labs alumni and a first-year college student in Arizona. Here's Morgan now.
I voted through mail this year. I got my ballots into my dorm room, and I actually already filled it out and sent it back. But for a lot of my peers and friends, I know that they're struggling and that they have not received their ballot yet and are nervous about voting for the first time through mail, and they really want to make sure their ballot counts.
For college students that are registering to vote when they're away from home, we recommend that they check the status of their current registration, see if they're registered to vote at home, and then decide from there whether they want to register where their campus is or vote absentee where their parents might be living. They should go to www.headcount.org. There are state-specific pages that outline the information that you need, along with our Make Your Vote Count site, which will actually go down into those menial details, such as what signature needs to be used to make sure that your absentee ballot counts, along with some issues in Pennsylvania, for example, about the secrecy envelopes that I think people have been hearing about. We have specific instructions on how to make sure your vote counts absentee in Pennsylvania and all other 49 states as well.
So do your homework, make a plan, make sure your vote counts. That is Kellen Edmondson of Head Count joining us. Thanks so much.
Hi, Joshua. How you doing?
Hey, Mr. Smith. I'm doing good. How are you?
Busy doing virtual learning, as you know, since you're in my class, but also preparing to vote.
So I wanted to ask, do you have any advice for me, being an upcoming first-time voter?
Really pay attention to what's going on in the news and get as big a variety as possible. So I wouldn't rely on things that are posted on like Instagram, Snapchat exclusively. Take a time to watch the local news, watch some of the national news, and become an informed citizen. I think the worst thing that you can possibly do is go into the voting booth without a plan.
When was the first time you actually learned about voting?
My family is a huge voting family, so it's always been present in conversations, particularly from my grandparents' point of view. My grandma was an adamant voter because at one point in her life, she was not allowed to vote as an African-American woman. So when that opportunity came, she made sure that not only did she exercise her right to vote, but she made it very vocal that every single grandchild, niece, nephew knew that she voted and why we should vote, and made sure that we understood that it's our civic duty to vote, not something that is a good thing to do.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mr. Smith.
Well, you know, I'm here for you, Josh.
Every single day, users upload millions of hours of content. It is impossible for any human to watch, read, and consume even a sliver of that. Media literacy is a survivor skill in today's world. That's the ability to identify and understand different kinds of media messages like news, opinion, entertainment, and even misinformation. Our partner, MediaWise, is on a mission to spread these skills widely. Their MediaWise Ambassadors program raises awareness about this mission to slow the spread of misinformation. I joined the program recently, and now I'd like to welcome the newest member of the club, Sydney Black, a popular YouTube creator.
Hello, beautiful people. My name is Sydney Black. I am a beauty and lifestyle creator on YouTube, and now I'm also a MediaWise ambassador. All right, so as a digital native, it's no secret that misinformation is becoming a huge problem online. It's really getting out of control, you guys. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you guys some tips on how to talk to your friends and family if they may have shared some misinformation. These tips will help it to not be so awkward, especially at the Thanksgiving dinner table. All right, so number 1. Be transparent and stick with the facts. All good fact checkers will share their methods and sources to support their findings. Providing a research study or an interview that supports your claim, especially if it incorporates sources that the other person trusts as well, will definitely do more to get your point across. All right, now let's say your cousin says or shares something that really gets under your skin. First thing you should do is take a minute to recognize that you're upset and let yourself calm down a little bit. Once you've calmed down, you can decide whether you even need to respond. I spend a good amount of time on social media as a part of my job, and trust me, you wouldn't believe the amount of insensitive and rude comments I get. But I can't respond to all of them, and I don't want to. In order for my sanity, you have to learn how to just read it and let it go. You don't need to respond to everything. Now, if you do decide to respond, make sure that you put your relationship with that person first. If they shared or posted something online, it's best to probably have a conversation with them in private, whether it's in real life, on the phone, or in a private message. You're much more likely to keep it civil and actually come to a place of understanding when you have the conversation in private. And lastly, be nice. Be nice. Don't throw any low blows or bring up anything that has nothing to do with the matter at hand. No one wins with negativity. No one. Be patient, be accurate, and most importantly, be okay with not trying to change the other person's opinion. It's way more important to actually listen and make sure that the other person feels heard, because when we feel heard, we feel ready to listen as well. If nothing else, just remember to prioritize the relationship that you have with your friends and family. These are people you care about, so try and come from a place of understanding and compassion.
We're going to turn now to another MediaWise ambassador and a colleague of mine to learn a few useful fact-checking tips that can help us understand the difference between reliable and unreliable information.
Hi everyone, I'm Sreenivasan, host of PBS NewsHour Weekend, a correspondent for Aman Company on PBS, and host of Take on Fake, a YouTube show helping people debunk misleading claims online. It's hard to believe the term fake news was dropped into mainstream consciousness only 4 years ago. That's when journalists and academics started using the term to describe the increasing number of fake news sites and stories containing completely false information. Since then, the term has been weaponized and used as a political tool against uncomfortable truths.
So-called fake news can have real-world consequences.
You are fake news. Sir, go ahead.
We actually avoid the term altogether because it means different things to different people. Now, in 2020, we're seeing more misinformation and disinformation than ever before. The effects are pulling at the fabric of our society, creating confusion, fear, and making it harder to seek out reliable information. With so much information flooding our lives, we don't have time to be manipulated. It's honestly exhausting. That's why I'm here with 3 college students who represent the MediaWise Voter Project, a program from the Poynter Institute that aims to teach digital literacy skills to first-time voters in the 2020 election.
See? This is why context is so important.
They're called MediaWise Campus Correspondents and represent diverse colleges and universities across America. They've been training their peers how to tell fact from fiction online in advance of the 2020 election, and are here now to talk about some of the concepts they've been teaching and to show us a few recent claims you might have seen online. First, we're here with Evan Jones at Michigan State University. So Evan, what are the biggest threats of misinformation out there right now?
So the short answer is that anything that draws a quick emotion is something that's a misinformation threat. So when I speak to other college students about this, I kind of group them into 3 areas. And the first would be memes and miscaptioned photos. And, you know, sometimes memes are just jokes, right? And to point out any falsehoods would simply ruin the joke. Other times, memes just voice animosity. For example, this meme accuses Black Lives Matter protesters of defacing the Lincoln Memorial, but this defacing never occurred. Professional fact checkers at Snopes and factcheck.org both verified the image and found that it was photoshopped. So the second category of big threats is fake local news sites. So Nieman Lab, Journalism Research Institute out of Harvard, identified more than 400 hyper-partisan websites that are run by political operatives or political action committees that masquerade as local news organizations. These websites resonate with people not just because of their sleek design, but because they oftentimes don't have competition. Newspapers are closing at an alarming rate, and that leaves these hyper-partisan fake local news sites to fill in the void. Lastly, manipulated video. We're seeing more and more of this as election day gets closer. So these exist on a spectrum for how much deception they deploy. So they can be something as simple as you have a complete video, but it's out of context. It's missing surrounding videos, or you're looking at a video in isolation. On the far end of the spectrum, videos can be doctored or completely faked by artificial intelligence. We haven't seen as much of this as the previous examples in this election cycle, but the technology is only getting better, so it's important to be on the lookout for videos that are deceptively engineered.
We're now going to turn to Hannah Meow. Where are you joining us from today, Hannah?
Hi, Hari. I'm calling in from Durham, North Carolina.
Okay. Now, what are some of the questions that you should be asking yourself when you want to investigate a claim?
So there are 3 big questions you should ask yourself to help you evaluate something you're seeing online. And these questions were originally developed by the Stanford History Education Group. So the first question is, who is behind the information? When you're examining a post, we want to think about who posted it or who is making the claim. And what motivations might they have? What credentials do they have? Why should you listen to them?
So why is that important?
We all have our own biases, right? So being able to tell what someone's motivation is helps us give a little bit insight into why they might be spreading this claim and what they're hoping to get out of sharing it. So our second question from Sheg is, what is this person citing to back up their claim? Or in other words, what is the evidence? For example, if you see a claim about the coronavirus, is the information coming from the World Health Organization or a verified research or academic institution? Or is it coming from a relative on Facebook who has no scientific credentials, right? There's different ways to assess the credentials of someone and what sources they're citing.
So you're talking about who is it and what are they citing? So those are 2 kind of big categories that should automatically make you wonder, is this possible? Is this credible? Is this true?
Yeah, definitely. And then once we have those 2 questions, we want to move on to the third question, which is, what do other sources say? So this means we should be opening up multiple tabs and checking in with other reputable sources.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Zuna Ramos, a sophomore at Boston University, has been employing a couple of additional fact-checking tools. Zuna, can you tell us a little bit about those?
Of course, Hari. Thank you for having me. So lateral reading and reverse image search are super useful to combat misinformation and disinformation. So lateral reading was created by the Stanford History Education Group, and it consists of opening multiple tabs in order to evaluate information that seems questionable. Let's say you read something on a website and you're doubtful about its reliability. You would take this piece of information, paste it on a new tab while keeping the original tab open. So always make sure to diversify your sources. This means to read and keep open a variety of websites in order to gain new perspectives as well as avoid bias. Reverse image search is one of my favorite tools. It can help you locate any picture you want on the internet. This is incredibly helpful when you're evaluating those viral images or any other picture that is shared with the purpose to spread disinformation. So there are two types of these images. There's doctored images and out of context images. Doctored images are those images that have been altered and are often referred to as photoshopped images. So they can show a person meeting another person they've never met or the person being somewhere they've never been. Out of context images, though, have never been altered, but they're often accompanied by an eye-catching caption that gives the picture a new meaning.
Okay, let's take a look at an example. Viewers, what do you think? You can chat your answer down below.
This is a campaign ad. We're first going to go to Google, and once you're there, we're going to go to Google Images. Once we're there, you're going to see this camera icon next to the mic, and you can either paste the image URL, the image that you're fact checking, or you can upload the image. I'm going to upload it since I had it saved previously. You're going to open it, and it'll start searching it. And now all the articles that appear are those on the internet that contain this picture. I'm going to go to the one by the Gazette, which I found earlier, because it's the source where the picture was originally taken. So if we read this article, we can see that the image has been altered because the image was originally taken at a watch party for the Holiday Bowl. So this is the original image where we can see others wearing Holiday Bowl shirts, while in the image that we saw previously, it makes it seem as if Biden was in his basement alone, which we can see here that he wasn't. And just like that, you completed your first reverse image search.
Thank you, Zuna. And I want to thank all of the MediaWise campus correspondents for sharing their expertise. It's not always easy to stop and think critically about every piece of information we consume, but the more we do it, the less likely we're going to get duped, and the more we can focus on the facts that do matter.
So as we've heard, one way Gen Z is getting involved in conversations about politics and social issues is by creating media. Our Student Reporting Labs team interviewed some content creators about what voting means to them and how they hope to motivate other people to participate. Jayla Moore-Ross, an SRL alumni and former Gwen Ifill Fellow, is here now to find out how these young entrepreneurs pass the ballot. Jayla, take it away.
Thanks, Amna. Hey everyone! So I started working with Student Reporting Labs in high school as a film and journalism student. This year, I've hosted a special digital series called Pass the Ballot. I get to talk to up-and-coming artists and media creators about how they're using their platforms to talk about the issues that are important to them, like voting. And I can't wait for you to meet our guests. Sierra Riley Wilson is an actress based in Los Angeles. Miles Best lives in Oakland, California, and is the host of KQED's Above the Noise. Tanasi Delos is a co-founder of Civics Unplugged, a nonpartisan organization whose mission is to empower the leaders of Generation Z. And finally, Heaven Taylor Wynn, who is a digital journalist and is currently working at MediaWise. We're gonna go ahead and get started. So, since we're talking about the election and voting, I thought it would be fun to start off with a little game to see how much you guys know about our government. Do any of you guys remember any of your high school civics lessons? Because those are gonna come in handy right about now, okay?
Not even a little.
So
I just graduated from high school and I don't remember.
I'm gonna ask a question, and the first person to answer it gets a point, and then the winner of the game gets an SRO hoodie. Ooh. The first question now: what is the supreme law of the land?
Constitution.
Okay, 1 point for you. Good. Okay, 1 point for Tanasi. Okay. So, can any of you name one of the branches of government?
Executive.
Legislative.
Judiciary.
Okay. Yeah, you all get a point.
Oh. Okay, cool.
Who wrote the Star Spangled Banner?
Oh my god.
If you guys don't know the answer, it's okay. I can give it to you guys. Okay, it's Francis Scott Key. Sound familiar? The winner is Tanasi. So congratulations, you won the sweater. We'll be sending that to you. Now that the game is over, I'm really excited to jump into the real stuff and talk to you guys about what you're here for. Can you describe when you first learned about the concept of voting?
My great-grandparents, their house was actually a polling place. Like the garage was a polling place. So I just remember being like really, really little, like 5 years old. And I used to be I was the kid passing out the I voted stickers. So like that's when I first got introduced to like the actual concept of voting.
My earliest memory that I can remember is being really young and watching Disney Channel, and in between the commercials they had these little campaigns where all the Disney stars were like, go out and vote. Looking back, it probably did make a really big impact just seeing it in the media so young.
What role do politics and elections play in your life growing up?
I didn't really have a strong concept of what it was and what was really happening until maybe like middle school, when I took it upon myself to kind of be a little more engaged or tuned in to things. I really didn't get super engaged until like college, I would say.
This is something my parents do and it doesn't relate to me or matter to me, but now being 19 years old and a first-time voter this year, I've really learned how truly important it is, and I wish that I was, more involved in the conversation when I was younger, more specifics of the conversation. I think that kids should be involved in the conversation at a very young age.
If someone were to come to you and say, I don't want to vote because I don't think my vote counts, what would you say to them?
Your vote absolutely counts. It is very easy to feel like among the entire population of the US, you're just one tiny voice and it doesn't matter. But, each vote can tip the scale any different way. And it's so important to have a fair election that everyone has their voices heard.
I'm going to be a little radical. I think that, sometimes your vote doesn't matter. The whole point of this country is to build a more perfect union, build towards that perfect democracy, but we don't have one right now. There are millions of people who don't exercise their right to vote. There are hundreds of thousands who can't exercise their right to vote. Voting is not a privilege, it's a right, and it's not given to everybody. Young people this election are going to be forced to put in their first time vote through the mail, and, through polling, 75% of them don't know how to do that. And we are not, as a country, educating them well enough to do that. So right now, the systems in place suppress the vote. And before we can say everybody's vote truly matters, I think we need to fix the system so that it's a factual statement.
If you want to get people under the age of 18 to understand the importance of like these decisions that are going to impact us for generations, you have to have them understand things that are affecting them daily, which is usually going to be the local things.
Finally, our last question, Heaven, we're going to start off with you for this one. What advice do you have for young people that are going to be voting this year, for the first time this year?
Request a sample ballot, okay? Request a sample ballot so you know what's on that thing before you go to the polls, and then make sure you're registered, all of that good stuff. And be patient with yourself. This is it's a really momentous occasion, I feel like.
My advice for first-time voters is just breathe. I understand that it's scary and it's overwhelming. It is for me, but I used to think that you needed to know everything there possibly is to know about politics and the history of every politician ever, but you don't. The most important part is to just start learning and be aware of what's happening in the country.
Look down ballot too. Don't just vote for president. I think that there's, you don't need to be a political nerd to vote. You don't need to be a political nerd like myself to understand the down ballot stuff. Just like look up who's running in your district, look up who's running on your school board, right? Because Joe Biden and Donald Trump, their policies might affect you, but chances are the policies of the people running a little bit lower on that ballot are what's really going to impact your family, your school, and all that stuff. So, it takes 5 minutes, even if it's someone small, like reach out to them, send them an email, ask questions. Don't be scared of politicians. They're there to work for you. So make them work for you, make them answer your questions.
Thanks for having us. Like, I just think that's, thanks for reaching out, and all this work is always dope. I always love working with, student reporting labs.
I just want to take a selfie real quick.
Let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it.
I'm fed up with the state that my country is in, which is why this year I'm going to register to vote and vote for who I think will help make our country a better place.
I don't want to vote just because somebody told me to or because it's encouraged. I want to vote because I know it'll make a change.
This election is going to be monumental to figuring out how people are going to live their daily lives and about how COVID is going to be figured out.
Personally, I have not seen any local candidates reach out to the youth, which honestly kind of hurts me.
Probably one of the biggest issues is college tuition.
Basically, the U.S. is on fire, and how are we going to deal with it?
Rejoining the climate change accord, raising the minimum wage, and investing in green energy.
Nowadays, I think about politics constantly because it gives me anxiety that our democracy is getting stripped away and that human rights are continuing to be violated.
A lot of high schoolers really are capable of having a knowledgeable vote, especially with internet and information being as accessible as it is. If you're old enough to have a Twitter and to read Trump's tweets, maybe you should be old enough to vote.
I think I'm fine with not being eligible to vote because I engage with the political process in other ways, both through social media and through volunteering for local campaigns.
We can still engage in our democracy by going to city council meetings.
Recently, I've been sending out postcards about propositions and just getting out the vote and things like that. I'm also trying to figure out how to volunteer at polling booths in my community.
I do engage in democracy here in America by protesting and critiquing the way that this country is led, and these are all big factors into what a democracy is.
Democracy has become a little bit of a joke. Candidates can hide behind a banner of fake news.
Democracy to me is, in 2020, very chaotic.
America is going through a really tough time right now, and depending on who we choose for this next election, it's going to make or break the country.
This is the first time I feel like I have some say in what happens to me or what happens to my country.
Voting is the most powerful and non-violent tool we have in a democratic society, so we must use it.
Hey everybody, what's up out there? I hope you are enjoying these conversations as much as I am. It's so refreshing and so inspiring to hear such honest and thoughtful views on politics these days. It really does give you hope for the future. We have one more conversation though you're not going to want to miss. I want to turn now to an incredible group of journalists, people I am proud to call my colleagues out here in this journalism world. And we're also all MediaWise ambassadors, so go team MediaWise. We're going to dig in a little more to everything we just heard from Gen Z voters and first-time voters. Joining me now are three journalists who've been covering politics and the election on different platforms, and they can share what that's been like in this very strange, very difficult sometimes news cycle. They are Sreenivasan. He's my PBS friend and colleague who you saw earlier tonight teaching some media literacy skills. Hari, how are you doing, my friend?
Good. So far, so good.
So far, so good. All right. Savannah Sellers is also with us from NBC News. You saw her earlier, of course, talking to some of the first-time voters featured in this hour. Savannah, how are you?
I'm great. I'm happy to be here, and what a great last hour. Some amazing panels. Thanks for having me.
Truly. We're so glad you're here too. And finally, a big welcome to Peter Hamby, host of Good Luck America on Snapchat. That's a docuseries about U.S. politics. Peter, how are you doing tonight?
I'm good. I've probably learned a lot more from everyone on the show than they will from me, but it's great to be here.
I know that quiz that JLo was giving at the end. I was like, do I know the answers here? I'm not sure. Welcome to you all. Reminder to folks out there watching, join in the conversation, guys. Send us your questions. I'll put them to this fabulous round table and we'll get you some answers. But let's just start off. Savannah, kick us off here because you've been covering this election and politics. And I want to know, what are some of the stories about young voters in particular that you have your eye on, either ones that you don't think we're paying enough attention to or ones that you're excited to tell?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And I think first it just starts with what we've touched on a little bit in some of these panels. We were just hearing about this is the youth vote going to turn out? Will we see young people at the polls? We know this generation has been this activist generation. We know they have turned out for marches, for protests. Is that going to carry over to the polls? Will we actually see that number? We know 1 in 10 voters is a Gen Z voter. Are those 1 in 10 voters going to turn up? Are they going to be at the polls? Another thing that we have been keeping a close eye on at NBC News, and we've dedicated a lot of resources in general to climate change by creating what's called our climate unit. But leading up to this election, that's something really interesting to us with Gen Z, because we know that is something that is almost more generational than it is partisan when it comes to voting. And so with younger voters, a lot of first-time voters, that seems to be something that pretty much universally across the board, no matter where on the political spectrum a first-time voter might land, they do believe is happening, they believe it's man-made, and they believe something needs to be done about it. And we're looking to see what they do with their vote in that way.
Peter, what about you? How are you covering the election? I mean, we keep talking about election day being just a few weeks away, but the election is now. Millions of people have already voted. Voting's underway in most of the country. What are you keeping your eye on?
Yeah, I mean, typically, I worked at CNN before this, and this is the 4th presidential election that I've covered. Typically, I would be in Ohio or Texas or, Atlanta right now talking to voters. And I think that is something, if you watch a lot of news right now, is being missed. I do think journalists are traveling more than they were at the height of the pandemic. But for me right now, I mean, I'm not traveling very much because typically I rely on a camera crew, and, there's some sensitivities with my crew about getting on airplanes and their health. So I'm actually doing a lot of remote interviews with politicians. We've interviewed Joe Biden and Anthony Fauci. We just interviewed Madison Cawthorn, who's a millennial Republican. He'd be the youngest member of Congress if he wins. He's 25 years old. Sort of doing that stuff on Zoom and figuring out a way to make it compelling by asking people questions that they're not typically getting asked by the mainstream media. Politicians right now have a lot of choice in the interviews that they agree to do. They have more power than they used to because they can create content for their own channels. And a lot of times that means they don't want to do your sort of typical cable news interview on CNN. But when I pitch them to come on my show, I tell them, hey, the audience here, it's a lot of first-time voters. The majority of them are under 25. We're going to talk to you about things that hopefully they care about. So I'm trying to use Snapchat to my advantage in that way to book big political guests.
That's such a good point, right? The access has changed completely during the pandemic, which makes it a lot harder sometimes to get answers straight from the politicians themselves. Hari, I'm going to put the first viewer question to you, though, because this falls directly into your wheelhouse. This comes from Chris. He's 21. He's from Wisconsin, and he's asking, what do you recommend people do to break out of their echo chambers when it comes to the media they consume? What do you recommend to Chris?
Well, that's a good question, Chris. I think one of the easiest, most passive ways is if you're on different social media platforms, whether it's Twitter or Snapchat or TikTok, follow people who you don't actually agree with, just to see how they're thinking. I mean, it's incredibly passive. You don't have to have the subscription to every newspaper across the political spectrum, but if you're getting your information on different social platforms, that's actually a very easy way to do it. If it's not social media, then try watching a channel that your parents don't like on TV, right? So just to see why and how somebody sort of spins the same set of facts, right? So if you watch something like PBS or C-SPAN, or, you just kind of, you get the facts, you get, for example, like a congressional hearing, right? So you can go online and find the raw hearing on YouTube. And then you can kind of go to a couple of different channels and say, here's how they treated it. Here's the spin that they put on it. Here's their own flavoring. So just to try to get a little bit of an idea of how and why people think differently than you, that's a way to get out of your own bubble. And then the next time you meet somebody that doesn't think that way, it's easier for you to have a conversation with them.
I like how you're encouraging people to not listen to their parents. Watch things your parents don't watch. Don't listen to them right now. Peter, I want to come back to you for just a second, because this is a question I think all of us have gotten as journalists, which is about balancing how you feel in your own personal life and how you do your job. One of our viewers is asking, how difficult do you find it to separate your personal beliefs and political leanings when you're covering an election in particular? What do you have to say to that?
I mean, I think this plays a little bit off the previous question. I think it's important for journalists to get out of their own bubbles as well. And I think that as hard as it is to separate your personal opinions, once you get out of your geographic bubble, your cultural bubble, and your technological informational bubble, then you start to understand where other people are coming from, where their belief system comes from, how they process news and information. And, again, I spend most of my career covering politics traveling outside of Washington, outside of New York. And I think I do have a little bit of an ear, for cultural viewpoints outside of that ecosystem. And once you start to think about the viewer on that end and how they're receiving you, I think that you're a little more able to sort of push down any of your personal beliefs. By the same token, I do think that consumers are smart, especially this generation. That this is a no BS generation. They understand that objectivity is not a real thing, that fairness is a real thing, and that if you are authentic, and sometimes if you're just upfront about where you're coming from, maybe even you're an ideological journalist, I think people appreciate that, because you're not putting on any kind of like fake airs that, I think are one reason a lot of people tune out the news sometimes.
Guys, we got some great questions coming in. I want to try to get to as many of these as we can. And Savannah, this is perfect for you. It's something you handle all the time at NBC News. The question is about breaking news, which feels like it happens every 10 or 15 minutes these days. But Cameron from California is 22, and he wants to know, how do you fact check in breaking news situations? What do you say to Cameron?
I say to Cameron, I'm very lucky that I work at NBC News, because we have a fantastic team who is very dedicated to that. But look, I mean, that's one of the tough things right now, especially when a lot of what we're hearing that is really the news is almost unbelievable. It just feels like we can barely keep up with exactly what is happening. And one thing after the next feels like, wow, I can't believe this is actually happening, even to us as journalists. It still feels that way for us, but that's what we are dedicated to, especially leading up to an election. I mean, we've done this at NBC News for every major event, every convention night, every debate we're doing it. We'll be doing it on election night. We have a live fact check blog going on constantly at NBC News. We have dedicated teams that are just simply fact checkers, not simply, it's a very complicated job, but meaning that's all that they are dedicated to. It's something that we are constantly getting, as we're on air and it's happening. Of course, it's difficult in a breaking news situation when you're live on the air, but that's when you've got to rely on your team. And I think to Peter's point just a minute ago of transparency and being authentic, sometimes it's like, this sounds pretty wild. We are confirming it right now. This is what NBC News knows. This is what we've heard from other outlets, but here's where we're at right now, kind of level setting in that way. But on election night, we do not call a state until we are absolutely sure we have what's called the decision desk, and no one's even allowed near the area. It's stanchioned off. Well, I guess that was in pre-COVID times. We'll see what it looks like now and how many people are physically in the building, but it is absolutely something that we are so dedicated to, and it takes a lot of manpower at NBC News.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I mean, election night it's going to be all the more important on that one night. And Hari, I know this is not the first election night that you've covered, but folks want to know how you're preparing for this particular night. We mentioned at the top of the hour, it may not be like previous election nights. How are you getting ready?
Yeah, I think, I should be asking you that question because you're working Tuesdays and I'm not. But I think, look, part of it is contingency planning. I don't think that any of the other elections that I've ever been a part of have we had to think in this way about all of the possibilities and the eventualities when it comes to whether it's cyber attacks, whether our people that are in the field are actually safe and sound, because there is still a pandemic. I mean, are they going to crowded areas? Are they quarantining? I mean, there's that kind of thought process. And there's also really preparing for, well, what about how do we set the expectation level for our audience to not have a decision at the end of the evening, right? Because we've essentially bred an expectation over the last 25, 30 years that we'd essentially have a pretty good idea by about 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock who won. Well, if Pennsylvania and Michigan say, we're not going to have all our ballots counted by tonight, that's a guarantee. Well, what are you going to do, right? So at this point, how do we have that kind of a conversation? How do we even frame, if somebody tweets out, hey, this election is being stolen, and we say, so-and-so said that, well, are we already playing into a narrative because stolen implies that it was someone's possession to start with, right? So it's, things that I don't think I've ever prepared for this way.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, but I'd love to hear from each of you because we've heard from so many inspiring and thoughtful and informed and engaged and educated young voters out there. And I feel like Peter said, I learned a lot from them in the last hour, but I wonder if there's something you want to share with any of those first-time voters out there. I remember what it was like for the very first time to cast that ballot and what a big deal it felt like. I'd love for each of you to just share whatever you think it is they can use at this moment before they go participate in our democracy in this way. Peter, what do you say? Kick us off.
I forget who it was earlier, but there's been a lot of talk throughout this program about local elections. Yes, Joe Biden and Donald Trump will impact your lives. Yes, Congress will impact your lives. Some of the best journalists I know, some of the smartest people who worked in politics, really started out by volunteering and working for local, statewide, even city council campaigns. Like, they are some of the smartest people in politics because they don't get sucked into the national news environment, and they maintain a little bit of a grassroots touch to their views on politics. They don't get sucked into the Twitter wars and the Beltway conversation. Anyway, I would encourage people to study up and down the ballot, and after the election, take this excitement, this energy, this anger, frankly, this passion that we've seen in the last 4 years, and start to think about other races that can have maybe more of an impact. There's county executive races and city council races and school board races wherever you live that will impact your lives and also represent, the future bench of political candidates in both parties.
Such good advice. Thank you, Peter. Savannah, what about you? Any advice for the first-time voters out there?
Yeah, I would say that you've already demonstrated that you're aware of this if you participated in any of these panels or if you're watching right now, but that knowledge is power, especially right now, especially with as scary as this whole fake news underworld is. It's become mainstream. And not to also reiterate, don't necessarily listen to your parents, but do the research for yourself. Figure out what you care about. See where candidates stand on your issues, as Peter just said, both nationally, but also at the local level. You can figure out who you want to vote for if you dig in and look at where they stand on the issues and you're getting your information from reliable sources. And then I would also just say, don't be discouraged. I know there's a lot of negative talk right now about this election, about how it's going to go, how long it's going to last, how fair it's going to feel. No matter what, any of that, you are part of history by voting for the first time and by participating in this election. And that in and of itself is something to be excited by and to definitely exercise that right.
I love that. You're part of history. Hari, I'll leave the last word to you. What's your advice?
I'd say vote early and in person if you can, mail only if you must. And then once you get that out of the way, I would really encourage you young, healthy, vibrant, amazing people to volunteer to be a poll worker, because there's a lot of, usually it's senior citizens that are doing this. And if you want to cut down on the long lines, help.
Help. It's as simple as that. We could all use that help. You guys are amazing. I'm so proud to call you colleagues out there, and I'll be following your work. I know everybody else will be too. A big, big thank you to Hari Sreenivasan, Savannah Sellers, and Peter Hamby. Thank you so much. And I also want to thank all of the participants over the last hour, everyone in the audience out there too. Thank you for joining us and for joining in the conversation. And of course, a very big thank you to our partner MediaWise and to Facebook for providing support for this town hall. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Amna Nawaz of the PBS NewsHour. It's been my honor and a lot of fun to hang out with you for the last hour. Please stay safe, please be well, and please vote. Have a good night.